maybe share how they've changed things in their life with other people who might be at the beginning of that process, because that shares hope.
In a world desperate to tear itself apart, only one man, and some other people, stand in the way of total destruction. Together they will right the wrongs, make bad good, and single-handedly destroy evil, together. Who is this man, you may ask? This man is Jeff.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Jeff Jones and Friends Make It Better, the show that takes one of life's little annoyances, gives him a microphone, a guest and a podcast, and an unwavering belief that he can make absolutely everything better. Today, I am more than delighted to be joined by author, speech and language therapy expert, etc., more and more, Leigh Andrews. Leigh, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for inviting me onto your podcast.
No, it's certainly my pleasure. Oh, what kind of are you? Because you're not just an author, you're a speech and language therapy expert. Like, is there an overall title you give yourself?
I tend to introduce myself as a speech and language therapist, because that's a professional title. That's a legally protected title. It's a registered healthcare professional. I worked hard to obtain that title, and I take my job very seriously because I support people who are vulnerable and need help. So I am proud of that title, and I think it means something once people understand what speech and language therapist does.
No, I mean, certainly. I mean, your years of training, experience. Yeah, like I say, you've earned that title. And speech and language therapy, I think, and this is just from myself. So you're the expert. I mean, so very quickly, I will throw it out there about the book that you've published. So it's called "You All Effing Talk Too Much." Meeting speech, language, and communication needs in homelessness setting. Easy for me to say. So, within your kind of careers in speech and as a speech and language therapist, what kind of took you from becoming qualified and then going into this kind of homelessness? I mean, obviously you don't only work in homelessness, but it's an area which has triggered a path for you in it. Where did that start?
So I do only work in homelessness settings. The charity I work for, Change Communication, our charitable objective is to provide speech and language therapy for people experiencing homelessness. We don't work with people who are securely and comfortably and reasonably housed. But I did end up as a speech and language therapist after doing quite a lot of other things. I'm now in my 50s. I originally started my working career with Barclays Bank. Bless them. I don't really know how they put up with me for 4 years. I was an absolute nightmare cashier. So I grew up in Essex. In the community I come from, getting a good job and settling down was something that lots of people quite reasonably in that kind of community aimed for. And getting a job in a bank was was very respected and considered to be a good, secure career. So I did some A-levels. I got a job on what was called the Accelerated Training Program at Barclays Bank.
Ooh.
I know, it's fancy, isn't it? And started working in banking and very quickly realised it absolutely was not the job for me. Very interestingly, actually, when I started working in my first job, I worked for Barclays Bank in Minories. It's now a sandwich shop.
Oh.
And in those days, we had people called messengers who used to literally walk on foot, taking post and important financial documents to the different banks in the city. And our messenger was quite a strong trade union person. And I'd been interested in politics. I come from a family that had, an interest around politics and what was going on in the world. And this messenger really encouraged me to get involved in the trade union there. And so I did, and enjoyed that very much, and started to think more about how people were treated at work and how the world of work is structured and set up, and where is the power and who's got the money and those kind of questions. And so from there, I went off to university and studied economic and social history, but with a strong focus on what then was called industrial relations. We might talk about human resources or personnel management or, you know, those kind of things now, with the idea that I'd go and work in an HR department and, you know, try to be the good HR person. And then I went to university. So at this point, I was 23 years old. I went to university as what was then seen to be a mature student. Obviously, I look back on those halcyon days of youth now and think I was completely immature. And that absolutely changed where I was going, who I was friends with, how I spent my time. It was, really, really opened my eyes and opened all kinds of possibilities and opportunities for me. Attending university. This would have been back in the 90s. So, you know, again, a very different situation now for students who are taking out huge student loans. And, you know, obviously after COVID, lots of online contact with tutors and maybe not the same kind of opportunities to socialize and get involved in lots of things. But yeah, from there, my political interests and my sort of, I suppose, motivations for what was interesting to me and why I was motivated to get involved in particular things changed when I left there. Because I'd worked in a bank, I'd actually worked in the lending department at one point. And so I had an understanding of debt and how banks approach debt and debt recovery. So during my university time, obviously I did have some friends, including myself actually, who were in debt while we were at university. And I would help them. I would help them negotiate with their creditors and come up with reasonable repayment terms. So I went off after university and trained as a volunteer with Citizens Advice Bureau, and then wanted to move to London. I mean, I don't even know if that would now be financially possible for young people in the same circumstances as me, you know, with all the, London was still expensive and housing was still difficult to get, but there were a range of different options. Some of them less salubrious than others. I was never going to get involved in squatting. That definitely wasn't for me. But wanted to come to London. And one of the jobs that somebody I knew was involved in was working for St Mungo's, a homelessness organisation, which some of your listeners may have heard of. And so I got a locum job with them working in a hostel and started it. For the first 3 weeks, I came back from that job and cried. I was just so completely overwhelmed with the difficulties people were facing, how complex the issues were, and how much I had to think about how to respond to these individuals in ways that were supportive and helpful and made a difference. So I started doing that work after I stuck with it for the 3 weeks, got through it, and then started to, thinking about your podcast, make things a little bit better for people. And the way I did that was again related to money, actually. I started to do lots of work around welfare rights advice. And what I discovered is once I could help somebody with their benefits and their financial problems, they were much more likely to trust me and talk about other things and other difficulties they had in their life. So that's where the homelessness connection started. That was back when I was in my 20s. And I did loads of things in that field and in that area, because in 1997, when I first started working for St Mungo's full time, in 1997, we had a change of government. After many years of Conservatives being in power, we had a complete change of government. A Labour government came into power with a very significant majority. So we see echoes now in 2024, maybe. We're recording this just a couple of days before the general election. And when that Labour government came into power at that point, they came into power, I believe, with a manifesto commitment of reducing rough sleeping by 2/3. And they invested a great deal of money to make that happen. And they succeeded. I think this is something that, perhaps many people, especially younger people who work in the homelessness sector, may not be aware that that commitment was met, and it was met 6 months early. I mean, you would think it was fake news these days. So yeah, there's lots of money came into the sector. There were lots of developments, lots of experimenting with new ideas. And what if we tried this? And what if we tried that? There was a whole amount of money that went into what was called places of change, so trying to make hostel settings better for people and more effective for people who use them. So that gave me the opportunity to do loads of different jobs. And then after some years of doing all sorts of different things, I was managing a day centre service for people who were rough sleeping, and there was a big incident in one of the open areas, that obviously our clients used. I was a manager there, and because it was quite a big site and we had lots of different areas, the staff there used walkie-talkies to keep in contact with each other throughout the day. And a message came over on the walkie-talkie, a manager to the dining room, please. So we absolutely knew that was a big incident that was happening, because you didn't call a manager unless you really needed a manager. And clearly the dining room was where we had lots of people using our services there. So there was something going on. And I walked down there, and there was these two big groups of men. All of those men had very limited English, and I can speak no language aside from English. They are obviously very upset, and there was a big argument, toe to toe, not yet a punch up, but that's the next thing that's coming. And I thought, oh my goodness, like, they're obviously really stressed and angry. So they're going to really struggle to understand me in English, with all of that, sort of your brain being clouded, if you like, by that heightened emotional state. And I can't speak their language. What am I going to do? Like, this is going to erupt into a mass brawl. So the only thing I do remember is I took a deep breath and walked to the centre of the group, which is not what I would recommend to anybody because lots of bad things can happen if you get in the middle of it. But it worked. It worked. Whatever it was I said and did that particular day worked. And everything calmed down, and everybody carried on using the service, and that was great. And I went walking home from work that day and reflected on that. I thought, that is just amazing that with no shared language, we were able to communicate, all of us, because, those men were also interacting with me and taking into account the behaviour of, like, their opponent, if you like. So all of us together resolved that through communication, but not through spoken language, because we didn't share a spoken language. And I thought, that's just amazing. I want to understand better how this stuff works. And I was also very mindful of discrimination around communication. So I'm an Essex girl, and I have certainly been discriminated against on the basis of my working class regional accent from Essex. I absolutely know that. And I think many people who listen to this podcast will go, oh yeah, actually that, sometimes I felt that's happened, or sometimes I'm embarrassed about my accent.
Yeah.
Well, that's because society is making you feel embarrassed about your accent. There's these messages about, the Queen's English and how people should speak, and where you put your apostrophes, and all of these sorts of things. So that all of these things kind of come together. So that idea of sticking up for the underdog, thinking about where power around communication lies, who's got it, how are they using it, and how do we use this amazing, unique human quality of language to make things better for people who don't have very much at all. So, yeah, I went home, typed into the computer, as we do these days when we want to find anything out, and speech and language therapy come up. And at that time, the government funded your course. So I signed up and became a speech and language therapist. And then when I was at university and training as a speech and language therapist, I was 45 when I went to university. And I noticed that the clients that I worked with were not part of the syllabus. When we were talking about all of these different communication difficulties, we spoke about lots of different groups. And when you're a speech therapist, you learn about everything from, newly born babies or prematurely newborn babies, right through to, what can be end of life care when people are very old or experiencing dementia or, some type of terminal condition that affects their communication and swallowing. Yeah. But I didn't hear people talking about people experiencing homelessness. And I kept on, the training we had was excellent. City University London, I trained at, they superb, absolutely excellent. But I thought, I don't see my clients represented here or being considered within this discipline of speech and language therapy. And so when I finished the course, myself and some sort of trusted colleagues and friends got together and set up Change Communication to deliver speech and language therapy to people experiencing homelessness. Because at that point, there was absolutely nobody else, as far as we know, very happy to be corrected on this, but as far as we know, there was no other speech and language therapy service for people experiencing homelessness in the whole of the world. So we were the first, I was the first speech and language therapist to do that, certainly in the UK, but we think even wider than that. So yeah, we got it set up. Thought it would last a year because, obviously not-for-profit charitable organisations always trying to find funding, and thought, when it's a new idea and sexy and unknown, we'll get a little bit of funding, but everybody will get bored after a year and that'll be that. And that's not what happened because COVID hit in 2020. We got started in 2019. And I think, obviously, I wouldn't wish a global pandemic on the world, but it did happen. And one of the consequences of COVID, for us in the UK, is that everybody started to struggle with communication. Yeah. We had face masks on. We were using, these virtual means of communicating, and nobody knew how to take a turn in their Teams meeting. And we were all interrupting each other because we didn't have the same cues as when we're face to face. People wanted clarity. They wanted to know what to do. People needed clear instructions and advice, and many people thought that was lacking during that period of time. So I think possibly some of the funders we were approaching, their staff were experiencing difficulties around communication, and then would be thinking, wow, if this is tough for me as somebody, probably well educated with access to resources, hopefully, securely accommodated, what must that be like for somebody who has none of those things? So what we've found is that, funding has increased. We've had more and more people approaching us for support and assistance. And the more we communicate, the more people realise how important it is.
Wow. I mean, I don't think I've ever sat here and listened on this podcast for so long. And the whole kind of start to finish of your kind of journey through empathy and finding yourself and dealing with other people, and kind of almost the stepping stones or the bricks being laid to kind of get to actually start in the world's first. I mean, it drops so many questions, which I'm kind of going to ignore most of them to save treading over the same ground. But okay. So first of all, what is it, after that magnificent introduction, what is it that we are going to be making better today?
Well, I would like us to make communication in homelessness settings better.
Fantastic. Okay. Now, first question, maybe it is just me, and that's fine, it's my podcast, so I'll ask the question. But I have an understanding of what I think speech and language therapy is. Mm-hmm. So which kind of makes me think, after everything you've just said, I actually think I've got a little bit of maybe not a wrong definition, but maybe just a small part of what I think it is that as a whole is actually only a very small part. Could you define how speech and language therapy, homeless people, kind of what is it, the main barriers, or kind of your the people that you're helping, what's the kind of main barriers or the main things that you're tackling in the world of speech and language therapy?
Yeah, no, I understand. So one of the myths that can be out there about homelessness, and when I'm talking about homelessness, I'm talking about people living on the streets and living in homelessness hostels. That's the area I work in. Homelessness is a much bigger problem than that. Rough sleeping is the most visible part of, the spectrum of homelessness. But that's the bit I know about. So there'll be lots of other people out there you might want on your podcast to talk about other aspects of homelessness, but I'm going to concentrate on this bit. So one of the myths that's out there about the homelessness area I work in is that it can happen to anybody. So you may have heard this phrase, we're all just, 2 or 3 paychecks away from living on the streets.
Yeah.
That's not true. That's not true. We have research to show that the strongest predictor of adult homelessness is childhood poverty. So the first thing to understand about the work we do is the people that we work with, that we offer our services to, have usually experienced very difficult early lives. Now, when you're born, your brain is not fully developed. It will take up until, different views around this, but, up until maybe your late 20s for your brain to fully develop. And when the brain is developing very quickly in early childhood, if there are very difficult problems within your family, within your community, that can have an impact on how your brain develops. And what we see in children who've experienced what we call adverse childhood experiences. So these are either single, very stressful events that may have happened. This could be something like child abuse. It could be the loss of a parent. It could be mental illness within the family home. There are other things, but it could be those things. So when you experience these very stressful events, there's lots of changes that happen in the biology of your body, and that can make the brain more sensitive to stressful events and very vigilant. Your brain is very cued into threats and danger because you've experienced threats and danger when you're very young. So your brain's doing the right thing, trying to keep you safe. But for those children that happens to, they go to school and they're not best placed to learn because they're stressed and they're hypervigilant. And so they're not able to necessarily listen, pay attention, sit still, think about problems, put, this piece of information and another piece of information together in order to come up with learning, because the brain's not in the best context to do that. So those early years are when loads and loads of our communication skills begin to develop. As anybody listening to your podcast who's been around children knows, the speech starts to come. The more, first it's single word, then 2 words, and then maybe there'll be a sentence put together. Then perhaps they'll start asking questions or explaining things. And you'll see that developing over the course of somebody's life. And then as people get into their teenage years, they're much better at understanding how other people are feeling and putting themselves in other people's shoes, inhibiting initial responses, although this does take a little while in teenagers, I know, to fully develop. We've all been there, jumped in with something we shouldn't have done. Yes, that's true. And so all of those things start, develop and hopefully develop typically. But for the people we work with, they've often had very difficult early experiences that may well have had an impact on the usual development you might have expected around their communication. That then deprives them of some of the opportunities that they may have had in school, in building relationships, in learning, in being able to express themselves, seek help, talk about their emotional well-being, understand what other people are saying to them, think about, well, this person is a teacher and that they're able to help me with this, so maybe I should go to them for that thing. You need language to have those thoughts and think those problems through. So we see those children then struggle with the kind of support systems that might be available to them as they become teenagers. And then some speech therapists, Claire Westwood, who's the secretary of the Homelessness Clinical Excellence Network that I chair, for speech and language therapy, she talks about this thing called the school to prison pipeline. So for some of those children who have those very difficult experiences, school's difficult, they start being known as maybe the naughty kid, that maybe they're the child that it's difficult for the adults to like and to work with in positive ways. they start getting, maybe a little bit left out or feeling isolated. They don't make friends. They don't go to school. They'll skip off school, and then that opens up to a whole bunch of, well, what are they doing with their time, and what kind of role models and social networks do they then become involved in?
Another level of vulnerability, and
Yes.
adults being able to manipulate into what we see as county lines. And
yes, exactly. And how do they cope with their difficult feelings of loneliness and isolation and not connecting? Well, one way of doing that might be to use alcohol to dampen those feelings, or maybe use drugs to deal with difficult emotional things. So bearing all of that in mind, by the time I am working with somebody who has experienced street homelessness, they may still be on the streets, or they may be in a hostel. They may well have had many, many decades of very poor life experiences, very poor health. Living on the streets is extremely dangerous and harmful. That's why, we try to prevent that from happening. And we know that, for example, the average age of death of people experiencing this type of homelessness is 45. This is, pretty much half of what the general population in the UK might expect. So they can have some terrible health experiences. And some of those things might be brain injury. They may have had traumatic brain injuries or infections, or, other forms of, might have had heart attacks or cardiac arrests. That all impacts on the brain. Over half the people who are experiencing homelessness have had some type of brain injury. Your brain controls your communication. So if something has gone on with the brain, there may be an issue around your communication, because those areas that control that may have been damaged or affected. We see high unexpected levels of autistic traits amongst people who are experiencing homelessness. In order to qualify for a diagnosis of autism, there must be social communication difficulties present, difficulties with communicating with, other people around you, understanding the unwritten rules around communication and the non-verbal signals. We see high levels of mental health conditions, disorders, and poor mental health amongst people experiencing homelessness.
Especially with maybe an older community. Sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
The amount of mental health conditions that were misdiagnosed, certainly probably 20 years ago, or maybe even more recently, that's the naughty child.
Yes.
And actually, we didn't have the understanding of any other underlying conditions. And even now, when things like ADHD, for example, could be, for so long, has just been anxiety.
Yes.
It's gone, and so we're seeing that more and more. So I know I kind of broke your throat flow there. So how do they get to you? Is it social workers? So someone who's living or in and out of hostels or whatever it is, do they have social workers? How do they get to your door?
In my work, we generally work with people who've had very long histories of rough sleeping and hostel dwelling. And in my work, the individuals I see and my team see very rarely are being supported by statutory social work services. And that's a problem. One of the things that would definitely make communication in homelessness settings better would be to see properly funded social services teams being able to support our individuals, because they would definitely benefit from that. So the way people end up coming to our services is we do obviously lots of training. We try to get the message out. The podcast is one way of doing that, to organisations in particular areas. Our staff are paid. This is not voluntary work. So we do need organisations to support our charities. So sometimes local authorities will pay for our service. Sometimes charitable trusts will fund projects for us to deliver our services. So we will, once that's in place, we're then able to go out and say, right, all of the hostels in, for example, Westminster, we can provide a speech, language and therapy service to your clients and to you. Because the staff working with these individuals in hostels, or maybe in the homeless health team, or maybe social services, or maybe in drug and alcohol services, mental health teams, they need to adapt their communication to help this individual, because everything they're trying to do with the individual needs communication to make it effective. And communication is always about more than one person. So we work with the individual themselves to, assess their communication issues, where the problems are coming up. And we work with those staff to find out, where are you finding it difficult? What is it you're here to do? And what around the communication is getting in the way that we may be able to help with. So that can be as varied as we, and this is in part where the title of the book comes from, we tell the staff, speak less, give that person silence so they can process their thoughts. Maybe have some keywords written down or some pictures that will support people's understanding and will support their memory of what's happening in the meeting. So it could be very simple things like that, right up to us doing full, what in speech and language therapy we would call a full clinical standardized assessments of individuals using, forms and questions that have been tested and are known to test very particular aspects of people's communication. We help people with issues around their voice. We help them with issues around brain injury, around communication differences linked to things like autism and ADHD, which may not have been diagnosed in our clients, but the individual themselves and the people working with them are like, oh, I wonder if this could be. Because of the age, many of our clients are, in their 50s and older. So you're quite right, they would have missed out on that in school because we just didn't have the knowledge back in the 70s and 80s and even the 90s in the UK around this stuff. So we do loads of things to help people, and it will vary depending on what that individual needs.
A lot of people see an issue and expect someone else to kind of pick up the baton and sort it out. So the fact that you and now your team have kind of created this thing to help it's just amazing to me that we see homeless people. There are homeless people, and we do a little bit by offering food and water and whatever it is. And I'm very happy that my children always do that. But you never quite know what else you can do, and especially when there are people, maybe slightly older generations who don't give them money because it will be for drugs. Don't do this, and it's all negative conversation. And there's almost a lack of acknowledging that there's a human being within there. And especially if someone has communication issues and is struggling kind of with language, I suppose that then also becomes, people may think, oh, well, they're drunk, they're on drugs, so don't go near them, when actually they just haven't developed that level of communication, which is this kind of realization I'm just having now, because I probably would have, not in a heartless way, but been one of those people who think, well, hang on, this person can't speak properly, but actually it's just a lack of development.
Yeah, it can be.
So it's kind of just blowing up, like the levels of this is just something which I never realized. I like to think I'm a good person, but this is, the understanding of the people, your clients, people you're dealing with, now is kind of much deeper than it certainly was 20, 30 minutes ago.
Yeah, that's right.
So when you look, obviously you're helping the result of years of problems this person's been through. Where does the system, in inverted commas, where now should it be starting to prevent people? Because obviously I what you're doing is amazing, but an ideal situation is for you not to be needed.
Yes, exactly.
In the nicest possible way.
I'd like to be made redundant and have a little rest.
So is this at school, because it can't be, all the responsibility can't be on the schools. Obviously, we appreciate some parents aren't necessarily in a position or don't want to be in a position to support children when they're young. What needs to be done in that early stage?
So there's a short answer which covers the early stage, the medium term, and the long term, which is we need proper investment in our public services. If we had proper investment in our public services, school teachers would have smaller classes and would have more time to notice where there are difficulties. NHS speech and language therapy teams that work with children would have the ability to be in every school. There are speech and language therapists working in schools across the UK, but it's a postcode lottery as to whether there's an SLT in your school or not. And often schools are having to pay for that themselves. That's not a service the NHS is providing to the school for free.
And they're reducing budgets of the school. Means that then it's going to be something which is not taken up.
And for those children who, for those children who are experiencing difficult lives, for those families that are experiencing lots of disadvantage and challenges, if we had properly funded children and families social work teams, think how much more they could do. So the short answer is money. The slightly more specific answer is I completely agree. We could significantly reduce street homelessness if there were many more effective interventions happening far earlier in people's lives. And there's some good news about that. There is a recognition that language and communication is important for children. And obviously, as soon as they're in school, schools are working on that. Nurseries are often working in using play to support and extend children's communication, which is fantastic. So we need to see some of that stuff happening everywhere, in all of those schools. I'd also make a call for less snobbery around communication. We need communication, speaking, signing, language. They are unique human qualities and they are amazingly complex. And it is fantastic that we have an innate ability or an innate desire to connect and communicate with other human beings. We're social creatures. That's kind of part of our makeup. So we should really embrace all of the ways that human beings communicate, whether that be sign language, whether it be non-verbal, whether it be a particular dialect of a language or all of the different accents that people might use, the words that they're using. We shouldn't be criticizing people for communicating and saying they're not communicating in the right way. We should be enjoying it and discovering it and finding out more about it and being curious about these different communication cultures that exist in our world. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a time and a place for what we refer to in speech and language therapy as standard British English. There is a need for there to be clarity in writing. There is sometimes a need in particular context for clarity in speaking or, in other forms of communication. But let's be clear and explicit about that. So I don't think it's right, for example, that when children are not in the classroom in school, that there may be the way they pronounce a particular word or a particular word they use, as long as it's not an offensive word, a particular word they use is told that's not the right word. We don't use that word for that thing. Because they're in their downtime, they're in their relaxing time, they're now with their peers. And language change and development is driven by young people. So we should be letting them get on with it and making our language, move on and progress.
But quickly on that. So when my son uses it, he's 10, my youngest son, and he enjoys YouTubers, obviously a lot of them American, and he uses a lot of Americanized terms.
Yes.
And when I turn around and say, it's a path, not a sidewalk, I should just let him get on with it.
You should. Enjoy it.
You're the expert. You've already shown your credentials.
Yes. What you could do to him, what you could do when you're having these conversations is to say, that's interesting. I've noticed you use sidewalk. Can I use path? I wonder why that's different. Okay. So then what you're embracing is the diversity, and also you're being curious about how has he developed this? Where's that word come from? Oh, Dad, it's what I listen to on these podcasts, and that's kind of an American thing. So, let's talk about it. Now, of course, that would then enable teachers and in other formal settings, in other, employment settings or college or wherever it may be, to say, okay, class has started. We're now going to be using formal English. Because there is a need for that. the way the world is currently, that's how things are. There's going to be an expectation of formal English in certain settings and contexts. So let's just be explicit about it. It's not better, it's not worse. In some contexts, that's the language you need, and in others, you just be you.
That's great, and I will now stop saying when he says tomato. I will stop telling him that it's a tomato. One thing, and this isn't a talking point, it's just a statement. I'm glad you brought up sign language. I think it should be. I would love to know sign language. My brain doesn't work in a way where I can learn languages. I don't know what it is. I can't even learn an instrument. I can talk and I can create. I can't. It just doesn't work. But I think if it's taught from school age upwards as a language, I mean, it's a modern language. Some schools have it. I think everyone should be able to, because then you can communicate with just about everyone on the planet.
That's not correct. Many people do not know that sign languages are specific to specific countries. So there is American Sign Language and Chinese Sign Language or French, and they have to be translated. So the advice I give,
are they still translated? That's crazy.
Yeah. So obviously, if you're using British Sign Language and the other person uses British Sign Language, you crack on. That's lovely. You are signing the same language in the same way that you and I are speaking the same language now. But there are differences in sign language across the globe. So you can't communicate with everybody in the world with sign language unless everybody's going to be using one particular sign language.
Yes.
Sorry.
I know. No,
I'm bursting all these bubbles for you
fine.
today.
Do you know what? I knew there was British and an American. I just never really took into context that it would be a different forever. But yeah, let's just get a whole new world order in sign language. No, that's fine. Also, no, I'm not going to get sidetracked. Anyway, if everyone in the UK, if it's taught in schools, then at least people within their communities and have got a common language.
I'd go. I mean, that's great. And if somebody wants to ensure that happens, I'm all up for it. But we could do something that's maybe a little bit easier to do straight away, which is to talk about the different forms of communication that human beings use. And if you're struggling to communicate with one person using one form, try another. So this is something we're often speaking to homelessness staff and health staff about. There is an absolute reliance in professional settings that I work in. There's an absolute reliance on spoken language. Everything is communicated verbally to our clients. But we like to point out you can use pictures, you can use objects, you can use gesture, you can use written language, you can use sign language. If one doesn't work, try supporting it with one of the others or just switch over to that. So if we were very clear with people that there's these range of ways of communicating, and all of them are valid and valuable, then again we might hit some of this stuff around bias and discrimination around communication, and give people a few more practical skills. Because I can't speak any language other than English. What's interesting is when I go abroad with my husband, who's quite good at picking up different spoken languages, I can often understand better what another person speaking in a language I don't understand is saying or trying to communicate, because I'm so good at reading all of the other aspects of their communication, which, may be one of the reasons I naturally ended up in speech and language therapy. So that would be good, just to make it really clear, we can use this, or we can try this, or we can try this, and we'll just keep trying things until you and I reach some form of understanding.
And there's also humane aspect, humanitarian aspect. But anyway, that ability for two people to struggle to communicate, and frustration is okay, especially if it's an important subject, but keeping it as a frustration, but also an understanding that two people can figure it out.
Yes.
It is possible
yes.
to communicate and to solve a problem, even if you're not necessarily, whether you're not speaking the same language, but also just on the same wavelength. Everyone says, I just can't deal with people who are abrupt. But that's fine. You have an understanding that person is abrupt. abrupt people are probably less likely to soften. So you just bring yourself up to that. Okay, you want an answer? I've got a question. We can,
Yeah.
so all the hand gestures, but we can
No, hand gestures are
find a
great.
way.
Gesture supports language. You crack on.
I don't. I'm very.
I mean, this is one of the
I'm guiding
things.
in the planes when I.
This is one of the things we say to people when we deliver training is communication breakdown is absolutely normal. You will experience breakdowns in communication as a human being several times a day, every single day. The way that we can make that communication better is by not becoming frustrated, recognizing that actually we're engaging in a really complex cognitive skill when we communicate. And there's also people have different meanings, people for the same word, people have different words for the same thing, people have different accents I might not be so familiar, people have different preferences around their communication, and that's all great. But right now we just need to find a way to connect and understand each other. So let's try this and let's try this. So the respect in people when you're communicating helps deal with some of that frustration. Something I sometimes talk to people about is how communication is distorted over the telephone. So, when you're asked your name over the telephone and you may then spell it, some of the sounds of those letters, my name is a really good example, L-E, well, E could be E for elephant, it could be V for Victor, it could be B for Basil. It's really easy for that to be distorted over the telephone, and people can get a little bit shirty that, oh, but you didn't understand it. Whereas if you understand, oh yeah, it's difficult over the telephone, the sound gets distorted, then you can help that person out by saying, oh, I'll do that phonetically. It's not technically phonetically, but I'll do that phonetically for you. It's E for elephant. So, then everybody's chilled out, and then you can move on to the next thing you have to communicate about with a nice relationship started.
That's it. The actual important reason why you're on the telephone call. That's it, because everyone is, it's an opportunity. I mean, I love people. I do this podcast. We're 60 episodes in. Bar a couple of people who've been on a couple of times. So I've met people I would never have, and everyone has a voice, everyone's got a story, everyone's got a way, and this is, I don't know, probably my only kind of quality is that I can bring myself to the level of different people. And I think that's because probably when I was younger, I don't know, I wasn't the brightest, but I've always been able to blag my way through things because I can build relationships easily, and I can communicate, and I can almost mimic how people are. So I was never bullied because I could communicate to the tough ones, but also I was empathetic enough for the people who maybe were bullied, or the intelligent people, even though they were far more intelligent than myself. And that's what I kind of think of myself as a little bit of a, I know, almost a charlatan in a way, that I kind of have done relatively well career-wise, because I don't really know anything apart from how to get people to like me and understand, because I'm empathetic.
You can connect with people.
I like to listen to people.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's not, and you said a little while ago that you're big. Well, no, you said the title of the book.
Yeah.
Right. People just need to listen to people. God, it's almost like you know what you're talking about here, isn't it? This is crazy. So I'm getting all these little light bulbs going off my head. But yeah, it making me understand myself more, but also other people. Because one of the worst things I dislike is people who shout and scream because they've got something they want to say and the other person isn't understanding it, and the other person gets dismissive. You see it quite a lot. I mean, if you've worked in a bank, I've worked in a bank previously, you see it like there's money is an important conversation. Where is my this has gone wrong and I need to use this service, you have my money. Excuse me, but if you're going to talk to me like that, I'm not going to. And you're starting off in a completely different area, and this frustrated person just doesn't know how to communicate when they're frustrated, and this person who's probably maybe slightly afraid of the situation doesn't know how to communicate when they're afraid, so they just become loggerheads and the situation gets worse.
And so imagine that type of situation happening in a hostel where
Yeah.
we have an individual who has been homeless, has got lots of health problems, maybe some poor mental health. Maybe they are using drugs or alcohol. That they may be intoxicated to a degree, and something has gone wrong with their benefit payment. So they've got really, really small amounts of money, and that money hasn't turned up, and they're trying to get help. And there is now very few places you can actually go to the benefits department and see a person. They may be extremely stressed, so their brain is not able to think so clearly and think about all of the different options and manage their own emotional situations so that they present in a calm way to the people who may be able to help them. And they approach a hostel worker who's in the middle of doing something else in that very stressed out state. And that hostel worker says, I can't help right now. And so, which is almost certainly true and not unreasonable. But you can see how that would then trigger somebody who's extremely stressed, struggling to express themselves, trigger them into a situation of what may be called in the work we do challenging behaviour. Maybe they're swearing, maybe they're calling the worker something offensive, maybe they're threatening, maybe they're throwing things about. So in the work we do, we're quite interested in those types of incidents. And in fairness to many people who work in hostels, they are also interested because they want to minimize them and they really want to try to help the client with the problems they've got. So we're interested in what was going on, what was happening in the lead up to this thing, and what language exactly did they use, and what were they trying to do. So we might be talking to the hostel workers about, actually, the environment that you've got here is really noisy. There's loads of people interrupting, and maybe there's a radio on in the background. So can we do some things about that calm that environment down? Maybe the forms that the individual has to deal with from the benefit department are complex. They're not written in plain English. They're confusing.
No.
I know, exactly. That would be one of my, to make communication in homelessness settings better, put everything in plain English.
Yeah.
And then the individual themselves may really appreciate sitting down with somebody like us that says, we know that thing happened. Can you tell us more about what was going on? So you felt angry. Do you know what happens in your brain when you're feeling angry? And the bits that, deal with the communication, they start to shut down and not working quite the same way when you're angry. So what can we do about helping you with your feelings? And when you start experiencing these feelings, what would help to calm you down so that you can communicate what's going on in a different way? So I'm hoping that's an example of how what from the outside you might look at and think, well, this person's been really rude and aggressive, actually comes from a communication difficulty, and we can do something about that.
Do you know what I used to think, if I ever won the lottery, because I do think I'm a good person, or maybe I'm just trying to manifest myself to win the lottery. If there is someone listening out, I'm putting good into the world. That I think I'd love to. I always thought I had the solution. This is a big thing about me. I think I have the solution to just about everything, especially after a glass of wine or two. And I thought it was almost as easy as, building some, building a hostel or some flats or an address. So you give people an address, and I appreciate not everyone wants that. It's difficult for homeless people sometimes to go back into that environment. But pay for counselling, pay for addiction help, and all of this stuff, and help them write a CV and get interviews and bank accounts. And I thought that would then solve it. And then once they're up on their feet, you help them rehouse, and they're everything they want to be or can be, or the best version of themselves. But now I'm thinking, well, actually, it's not that simple, because there may be teaching of communication and teaching people how to interact with other people. And if they do have an illness which prevents that, then seeking the right help with that. And all of a sudden, what I deemed as a nice, easy problem to solve, of just giving people an address, a bank account, and some life skills and teaching, and is now actually really complex. Well, as we know, everyone's different
Mm.
anyway, and you can't just have one process that fits
But you know what?
all these
That's not what
people.
you're. Firstly, the things you're suggesting are excellent ideas, right? And some of those services do exist. Um, what we saw that kind of speaks to the thing you're talking about. What we saw during COVID. So during COVID, there was this thing called Everyone In, and that was a program where we were obviously. I mean, this was across the country. Where obviously homelessness organisations and the statutory services that working in that area as well were doing their very best to ensure that everybody who had been living on the streets was now placed into appropriate accommodation in order to protect them, as everybody needed to be protected from COVID. Um, and clearly, all of the hotels were empty because nobody could stay any longer. So
Yeah.
certainly in the areas I worked, there were hotels. We called them emergency hotels. These were normal hotels that opened their doors to people experiencing homelessness, and we saw. I'll speak from my experience. My experience of those things was as follows: people were moving into nice accommodation. These were nice hotel rooms with regular cleaning, clean laundry facilities, private bathrooms. That can be a very important thing for some of our clients because some of them, of course, have got illnesses or have been abused or, whatever. So private facilities. And all of the services came to them. All of the services came to them. Obviously, there were some services that were trying to do work virtually, but we stayed face to face. We did not operate virtually. We continued to deliver face to face services, as did homeless health services. We're doing face to face nursing, drug and alcohol organisations. A number of them were going into the hostels and ensuring people were getting the right support for that. GPs, of course, homeless health GPs were doing fantastic work. So clients loved that. We had clients who had refused all accommodation for years, even during freezing cold weather, go in during COVID and stay in. Not everybody, don't get me wrong. There were plenty of people who did abandon or their behaviour meant that they weren't able to stay in those settings. But lots of people accepted that accommodation and stayed in that accommodation. And they really appreciated the services they needed. And that's the kind of stuff you're talking about, going to them.
Yeah.
They didn't have to navigate 400 bus journeys and maybe very stressful environments and then waiting in a waiting room with lots of other people who are also extremely stressed. They really appreciated services going to them. So I think far smaller supported accommodation opportunities for people with specialist services coming in, supporting not only those individuals, but the staff that are working with them in the accommodation would make a huge difference. And because of the way homelessness and street homelessness has been viewed over decades, many of the buildings that we're working in now are far too big. We regularly work in settings where there's maybe 60 or 70 or 80 people living in those settings.
Right.
And they've all got a whole bunch of needs and a whole bunch of things that they would like support with, but that's very difficult when you're simply trying to ensure that the building is safe, everybody is safe, everything is working, the lifts are working and things are made clean. So we need much smaller accommodation options for people. We need flexible, professional, high quality services of the sorts of things you were talking about, including speech and language therapy, going in. And one of the biggest developments in the field of homelessness in the last 10 years, in my view, has been the development of what we call psychologically informed and trauma-informed environments. So this is where organisations have received some training from psychologists around understanding how the brain works and understanding how, when people are experiencing difficult emotions, what their behaviour might look like. And rather than saying, that person's been offensive, we're going to evict them, or that person was really angry and we're all a bit scared of them that day, we're going to evict them. Obviously, you do need to keep people safe. You have to factor that into your planning. But asking, but why? Where's that coming from? What happened? What were the triggers for that? What else could we do to support that individual? Perhaps think about these things differently or move into a different way of dealing with those issues. So many of the staff in homelessness settings have a level of awareness around psychology and trauma and the impact. And they're doing really great jobs with that. They're trying to be really understanding, and they're very keen to work with the specialist services. So specialist services, from the NHS and social workers and education and employment and the benefits organisations, they need to be working in those flexible, trauma-informed ways in those places, Not all of the time, but we certainly need to offer those services there. So you would get my vote if you were standing in this general election. You're on the right path. Keep going.
There's just so much more. I mean, yeah, I was like, so the easy answer is more investment. Like, from where you are and where you sit within the framework, like, does it seem easy to you? I mean, for me, when people say, "Oh, well, there's the money and people need to look after themselves more," and all this kind of stuff, my response is usually, if you help someone get back on their feet, and they are, if you see a 30-year-old gent on the streets, if you spend 5 years helping them through their trauma, through everything they've been through, and then they get a job, no matter what the job is, they then becomes a consumer, they become a taxpayer, they become someone who is no longer, inverted commas, a burden on society, but they're an active member who should then be celebrated for going through probably a hellish first 30 years or so, to now someone who is a success story. And it's not just investment in infrastructure, it's investing in people, and the belief that people don't want to be in the situation they're in. If they are considered a bad person, they may not necessarily want to be a bad person. They just need the help to be someone who they do want to be. But they've seen that actually it's a lot easier, not easier. Their options are limited. So this is the path they've gone down, because they've always found support that way from other influences.
Yeah. I will just put a little bit of it, not exactly a challenge, but just to kind of, broaden this out. Many people, still including people who fund homelessness organisations, and some of the homelessness organisations I might come across, as I go about my business, see a continuum. Somebody's on the streets, they've got drug and alcohol problems, they may have some mental health difficulties. We pick them up, we give them the support they need. They come out of that support, and now they live independently, and they're working, and they build relationships, and maybe they have families or whatever it may be. And that's great. That may well be what many people experiencing homelessness want, and that's what they're aiming for, and that would be fantastic if we can do that. But I work with people who will always need that support.
Yeah.
They may feel safer in an environment where there are staff on site 24 hours a day. They may never be able to manage their finances completely independently. They may always want support to be able to understand what's happening. They may always struggle with their mental health. We see famous people talking about they have mental health difficulties or one form or another, and maybe a clinical diagnosis, and it's something they manage over their lifetime. So for some of the people I'm working with, they will always need to be in and they would like to be. I think this is an important thing that sometimes gets missed. Not all of our clients want to go off and have their own flat. They might want their own flat, but they might want a support worker to be on hand to assist and to have that reassurance. And if things do get a little bit tricky, to know that they've got that help. So that, in my view, with the way that society currently is, we will always need those higher level support services in this field. Now, the other thing about the money is, you're absolutely right. Of course, if somebody does need a little bit of time and a little bit of support, and then that's it, they're back on track, and they're working, and they're earning Pantac, that's fantastic. That's great. Of course, we want to see people living their best life. But even for those people who may continue to need financial support in the terms of support services and benefits and accommodation from the state, if that support is properly provided to them, what we will see is a massive reduction in emergency admissions in hospital.
Yes.
A reduction in maybe uncontrolled, dangerous drinking in public places, which may then lead to, people being quite upset or feeling fearful. We might see a reduction in suicide attempts. We might see an improvement in their health because now they're making use of planned appointments which help manage their conditions rather than everything being an emergency, and we might see that they live longer and they feel better. So this is what we call the invest to save argument. Let's invest some money in this group, which without the investment is actually costing the public purse a great deal of money. With the investment, they're still going to cost the public purse, but now we have a better environment for everybody.
Yeah. And
now we're
a controlled
it's
a controlled investment, and people are healthier. And
yes,
that's essentially, there should never be an argument. It should be how much money does it need? Well, it needs enough, as much as it needs. Unfortunately,
yes.
not everyone looks at it that way, because me as an empathetic and I like to think nice person who had up until the last hour all the answers, and they were good answers, they were nice answers, now has this broader understanding, and everyone just needs to listen to you talk for an hour, because even me, who was like, no, I'm a good person, I'd like to do this, is now, well, actually, no. I said people don't. There's a lot of people who aren't going to be in a situation where they're going to become the productive member of society or whatever it is. But actually, and as you were saying, I was thinking, oh yeah, the amount of spent on policing and
Yes.
Because assumedly as well, a lot of antisocial behaviour, people with communication difficulties, who are people who've they've broken the law because of necessity or lack of tolerance from people around them. So they end up in the prison system, which then has its own costs. And as you were saying all those things, you're thinking every single aspect of that has a cost. And we always look at it negatively, don't it? Oh, drug addicts cost the state this much money. Well, yes, and so let's help them in a positive way and spend that money, shift the money from one to another.
Yeah, exactly. And many of the clients we work with, and certainly, I know from other services, some of the groups they're working with, they've got skills, they've got abilities, they've got interests. They've got no chance currently of being able to do anything with it because of all of the, the difficulties and chaos and challenges they've got. But once you start to help stabilize that situation and show recognition of them as human beings, just as you said right at the beginning, and not, a problem, well, guess what? Then they're able to share some of that stuff with you. Maybe there's somebody who can, plaster walls or, build something or garden, or maybe they've got musical skills that they could, do you know what? I'll play a little bit of music during breakfast so that it's a nice environment for everybody to come and have breakfast in the hostel. There are all sorts of untouched skills in the clients that we work with, including their ability, if they were in the right place and felt they wanted to then maybe share how they've changed things in their life with other people who might be at the beginning of that process, because that shares hope, that shares possibilities. So there's lots of things that the people I work with, and some people are doing that, but there's lots of opportunities there to make the world a better place for lots of individuals. But we have to spend the money first to save the money later.
I'm a little bit emotional over that. That's
good.
I'm not going to ruin it by kind of continue to spew my rubbish all over the place. So what I'll say is, and I feel like, so we've covered a lot, and I could talk to you for hours, but I'm sure you've got other things. Well, you've actually got to go and help them, not just talk about them, but you've got to go and help people. I've got to sit and complain about editing and everything. So we've spoken about the problem, the start of the problem, kind of the problem when it reaches you, all the different factors. I feel like obviously the way to make it better is investment, and also changing people's understanding of the issue and the situation. So usually this is where I say, Leigh Andrews, how are we going to make this better? But you can do that, but I'd also like it to be a little bit of a call to action. Like
Yes. Oh,
if you were talking to someone who doesn't understand or has money or both, give us a call to action. How do we make it better?
well, fortunately, I've got a list. I came prepared. Let me go through the list, and I'm going to start with things that don't necessarily cost money, or things that don't necessarily cost very much money. So we can think about calmer communication environments. Let's look at the noise that's going on in an environment. Let's look at the barriers that might be in an environment. Let's make environments clear to understand. Is it clear which button you press to get into the building, or that you turn left to go and see the person that you need to see? So that's something that wouldn't take much money or very much time. When somebody comes into your building or approaches your building, or maybe calls your service, looks at the website, have you got it set up so it's clear and easy for people to understand and find their way about? So that's one thing. Slow down when you're communicating with people. Say less. This is to the professionals, most certainly not to people experiencing homelessness. We need to hear more from you guys. Say less and make your meetings focused, prepare for them, and keep them as short as possible. Our clients don't necessarily want to spend an hour going all around the houses because you didn't prepare in advance for your meeting, know what was going to be discussed there, and have everything ready for the individual. So next thing, costs nothing. We've discussed it a bit already. Embrace the diverse communication that's used by everybody. Stop snobbery around accents and vocabulary. I think your son's going to love that one. Then ask about, again, this doesn't necessarily cost money, but it does take a bit of time. Thinking about, organizations working with people who are homeless, ask about what the person you're supporting, ask about what their communication needs and preferences are. How do they like to receive information? Write that down, record that information, and act upon it. If somebody says that they struggle with reading and writing, well, the very least you can do is ensure that anything you give them in writing is written in plain English, and maybe you can get some free images, from the internet, or use icons that are available in computer packages to help them understand what's there. So ask about it, record it, act upon it. There is free training available for clinical professionals who are working with people experiencing homelessness. That's available by a fantastic charity called Fair Health. And also the NHS has free e-learning available around homelessness that certainly people who are able to access that can do. So for clinical professionals who may not always work with people experiencing homelessness but want to know more, get on your NHS e-learning for health and you'll find there's lots of stuff there. We need communication training for staff working in homelessness. Often when I deliver training about communication, staff will say to me, oh, we've had training around communication. What they've usually had is training around active listening skills and the kind of more general counselling end of communication. And that's great and it's needed and it's necessary. That is not the same thing as understanding how the brain develops around communication, how the brain can be different or the brain might be damaged, which affects communication. Other health conditions that can affect communication, and then knowing what to do about it. That's a completely different course, and you need a speech and language therapist to take you through that. So we need to see more of that happening. And I think that we also need more speech and language therapists. Just generally, there's a massive workforce shortage of speech and language therapists. It's difficult for everybody to get the speech and language therapy that they may need. But we've got very few working with groups experiencing homelessness, and yet we know that they're much more likely to have communication difficulties compared to the general adult UK population. And read my book. You don't.
Yeah.
Maybe the publishers won't be best pleased about this, but I understand books are expensive. I get books from the library. Ask your library to buy it, and then it's available for everybody for free. Which is why we should also support libraries. That's a great way of supporting communication development, libraries.
Fantastic.
That's my list.
and what is, and do you know what? There was nothing on there, which was shocking.
No.
It's just, it's nothing that us or me sat here in nice little, up 2.5 bedroom, semi-detached kind of things. Well, it's a given. That's actually, but the reality is it's not happening or could happen or should happen. It's this has been. I could talk to you just on the subject for forever, because I understand why you're passionate about it. I love your story of how you kind of came to it, and how your passion for homelessness and speech and language therapy just has grown through different career paths, and kind of falling and meeting the right people at the right time in your life. And now you are the person who is trying to help other people meet the right person at their time of need.
Yeah.
I honestly, I can't thank you enough for coming on. Give us
Very welcome.
another quick promo of the book. We've spoken about the services, and the services are number one, but there is a book out there.
There is, yes. Do you want me just to say very briefly who it's kind of aimed at, really?
Yes.
So it's called "You All Effing Talk Too Much." That I didn't say that. That was something I heard a person who was experiencing homelessness say, and I thought they're right. So the quote has come from there. The subtitle is "Meeting Speech, Language, and Communication Needs in Homelessness Settings." It has a brief introduction to the type of homelessness that I work in. It has an introduction about what communication is. It's written so that, yes, if you're a healthcare professional, if you're a social worker, if you're a teacher, if you're a college lecturer, it's written for you, but it's also written for people who may be working in homelessness settings and left school at 16, because I'm a big fan of plain English. So I really hope my book is accessible to lots of people. And then the chapters talk about what speech and language therapy is, what speech and language therapists can do, and how they can help use their skills to end homelessness. And then it also talks about what commissioners, people with the money, the funders, the local governments, the government, the charities, if they want to support communication to be better in homelessness settings, how they can go about getting those projects set up, and the sorts of things they need to think about to ensure that these are safe clinical services that are being offered to people. So if you work in homelessness, it's a book for you. If you work in communication and you're interested in homelessness, it's a book for you.
Fantastic.
J&R Press.
J&R Press, or the library, but
library.
First, J&R Press, and have a look, and then I mean the message is the most important, and I'm sure even your publishers will understand that. Again, thank you so much. It's been
You're welcome.
Just an amazing conversation, and that's why I love doing this podcast, because sometimes we talk crazy and sometimes we talk about a crazy situation, and this is certainly one of those situations which is just can be resolved, can be helped, and it's just crazy to me that it's not. Hopefully once the selection business is out the way, and whoever it is leading the country, they kind of have a look at kind of social causes and investment, and that you can invest money over time in people to reduce costs, and that if that's what's that really important to them, but essentially invest in people's happiness and well-being, and maybe everyone will be a bit happier. Who knows? That would be nice, wouldn't it?
It would be great. That'd be fantastic.
Right, all there is so please everyone check out the social media. Is that personal?
I've got both, so you can find me on Twitter as at the little at sign Leigh Andrews, my name. You'll find me there, and you can also find my charity, Change Communication. We've got a website, www.chgcomm Charlie Hotel. What do you for G? Charlie Hotel Golf Charlie Oscar Mother. We've got that. That's probably the main main things.
That's the main.
And you can contact me via our charity website as well. And please do, if you want to partner, fund, advice, please do.
Excellent. Do it. Do it. And if you need to speak to, then you're too worried or you don't know how to communicate and reach out, then you can find Jeff Jones and Friends Make It Better. Generally, over most social medias, it's at Better with Jeff, which I do appreciate. Sounds a bit like a dating line. It was too late by the time I set it all up. There's YouTube as well, Jeff Jones Friends Make It Better on YouTube, which is just generally things about my dog. And that's Instagram as well. It's just my dog, really, and I put on a little voice for him because I'm helping him communicate. Generally he's just moaning about stuff. Everyone, thanks so much for listening. All there is for me now is to say thank you, and it's goodbye from me, your host Jeff Jones, and it's goodbye from Leigh Andrews. Leigh, say goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody. Take care of yourselves.